This video isn't going to spend too much time focusing on fights or a background in which what I did for the initial part 1 video, which got a lot of really good attention. Granted, didn't get a lot of views overall, but the overall interactions with it, from the comments to the amount of likes I got, is probably one of the better videos I've done over the last year and a half, I should say. So I wanted to follow up a part 2 just to kind of go over this intermediate period of Golden Boy from 2005 to 2007. Now, for many people, they don't really spend much time focusing on this time period because for them, not much happens. It involves the retirement of Oscar De La Hoya and then ultimately the unretirement of Oscar De La Hoya the following year. And then it kind of leads us into setting the stage for what will be part 3, which is kind of Golden Boy entering its golden era. But we have to talk about this period from 2005 to 2007 because this period is ultimately one that gets glossed over. And the big reason why we have to do it is at this point in time, Oscar De La Hoya, who is coming off of essentially a knockout loss to Bernard Hopkins. He is ultimately in a position where he has been trying for his longest to get rid of his contract with Top Rank. And for many people, as they know, Golden Boy Promotions at this point is considered to be, in most boxers, a subsidiary of a boxing promotion where they can put their likeness and their branding onto the actual fight. But Bob Arum and Top Rank are the main promoters of the show. So there's no way for Golden Boy to really kind of exercise and flex their ability to showcase themselves. But once Oscar De La Hoya retires, he gets right to work. And it involves him also bringing on Richard Schaefer at some point. It also involves him reaching out to former opponents that he's faced, guys who have a really bad taste in their mouth for promoters who have taken advantage of them. And those two guys are Bernard Hopkins and Shane Mosley. He brings them in as investors. He also brings them in as the guys who are going to kind of help piece together his company while he is in retirement. And ultimately, I always felt that Oscar De La Hoya at some point was going to unretire and come back to the sport. Especially because at the time of his retirement, he was, I believe, 33 years old. And granted, he'd been fighting for almost 15 years at the time. But for many of us, we ultimately felt that Oscar De La Hoya at some point was going to come back to the sport. But I think for him, he wanted to get as much legal work out of the way with dealing with Bob Arum. And I think for him, the best case scenario that he had was the Marco Antonio Barrera versus Erik Morales trilogy fight. And for many people who have not seen the Marco Antonio Barrera versus Erik Morales trilogy, I highly recommend it. It's probably one of the best trilogies that you'll ever see for that era of boxing. And for many people who have stumbled onto boxing as of recent, especially as we went into the Floyd Mayweather era where you saw a large influx of boxing fans come back into the sport, many people are not quite aware of just how good Morales and Barrera was in their younger days. These weren't just two Mexican fighters who believed in Mexican style and that would lower their heads and they would just throw punches and try to knock their opponents out. No, Barrera and Morales were prototypical boxer punchers. And where Barrera was a little bit more technically skilled, Morales was a little bit better on his feet. And for these two guys, if you watch their fight, there's so much high IQ boxing that happens between it. And it kind of gets overshadowed with the fact that leaving the Barrera-Morales situation, both these guys took a massive downslide in their careers just because those 3 fights were the fights that ultimately made their careers. For Marco Antonio Barrera, he ultimately ended up retiring after he fought Manny Pacquiao about a year later. And then for Erik Morales, who was coming off of the 2 back-to-back losses to Barrera, he ends up pulling out an amazing upset victory over Manny Pacquiao in 2005. And then ultimately ends up losing to Manny Pacquiao, having to come down in weight after he ends up getting absolutely embarrassed by Zahir Rahim. So for both those two guys, many people feel as if the trilogy that they fought was essentially what started their decline. And for a lot of fighters and a lot of fans who came into the sport around that time, they don't really spend enough time going back and looking at the things that Barrera and Morales accomplished. But the reason why that third fight is very important is because this was the first time that Golden Boy was able to operate as its own entity versus Bob Arum in Top Rank. And for Oscar De La Hoya, he represented Marco Antonio Barrera. Of course, you know, Bob Arum represented Erik Morales. And in this third fight, many people expected it to be a 50-50 fight. A lot of people looked at the fact that Erik Morales didn't fight the type of fight that he should have fought in the second fight in comparison to the first. So many people felt that he could just turn that around and he could fight the third fight how he fought the first. For Marco Antonio Barrera, had all the momentum going into that third and final fight. And he had figured out a way to make Erik Morales stop being the type of boxer puncher who could move on his feet and forced Erik Morales to fight his style of fighting. And ultimately, in the end, Barrera comes out on top in that third fight, and that's the fight that kind of pushes Golden Boy through the door with their first marquee matchup. It's amazing how we use the Barrera versus Morales third fight as what introduces Golden Boy into the market, considering the fact that it didn't involve Bernard Hopkins, it didn't involve Shane Mosley, and it didn't involve Oscar De La Hoya, three of the biggest names at the time in the sport. But what it did do is it did show that Oscar De La Hoya not only has, you know, the balls to make a gamble like this, but he's also very, very serious about moving forward in his career as a promoter. So then obviously comes 2006. And 2006 is where Oscar De La Hoya looks at the fact that Bernard Hopkins, despite the fact that Bernard Hopkins is also coming off of breaking off the middleweight, win streak, Bernard Hopkins suffers a loss to Jermaine Taylor in 2006. Well, coming out of 2006, 2005 is when he took back-to-back losses to Jermaine Taylor. But in 2006, Bernard Hopkins does something that not many people in the history of the sport does. He jumps 2 weight classes to fight the lineal light heavyweight champion of the world in Antonio Tarver. And of course, as many as you know, Tarver is essentially promoted by Don King. And Bernard Hopkins pulls off that upset, and he ultimately retires. And for Bernard Hopkins, this was a massive big deal for him to move up in weight, 2 weight classes, and to beat the best light heavyweight on the planet. And for Shane Mosley fights 2 very, very exciting and well worth victorious fights against Fernando Vargas, especially considering the fact that going into this time period, Shane Mosley was coming off of back-to-back losses to Shane Mosley. Shane Mosley was coming off of back-to-back losses to Winky Wright in a fight where Shane was essentially outgunned. He was outmatched. There was no way that his speed was going to be able to bother Winky Wright. I think at one point, the only thing that he was able to do is Winky Wright decides to drop his hands at one point versus Shane Mosley, and Shane cracked him. And it hurt him. And I think that was Winky Wright saying, "Oh, I shouldn't really fuck with doing that." But outside of that moment, Winky Wright absolutely dominated Shane Mosley, and Shane Mosley really needed the Fernando Vargas fights to get himself back into contention. Shane was also looking to move down in weight at the same time. So that takes you into 2006. And that's within 2006 that Oscar De La Hoya announces that he is unretiring and he is going to come back and fight. And the big reason why many of us are expecting that fight, number one, fighters do this all the time. They always retire and then they unretire. But a huge thing that plays into motion is Oscar De La Hoya is still craving what still manages to be a career-defining fight, mostly because he knows that as good as Fernando Vargas was in terms of a win, Fernando Vargas has never really been the type of fighter that you looked at on the surface and you were going to say that this guy was going to be the best pound-for-pound fighter in the sport. And Oscar De La Hoya, every time that he stepped up to trying to beat that type of fighter, he's not been able to. He lost to Trinidad, albeit how you felt about it. He lost to Mosley when Mosley was unofficial pound-for-pound number 1. And he lost to Bernard Hopkins when Bernard Hopkins was unofficial pound-for-pound number 1. Oscar De La Hoya now has the opportunity to get one more shot at it. And all he has to do is pick up a title. And for him to kind of pick up a title, he knows that all roads lead to none other than Pretty Boy Floyd Mayweather. And Floyd Mayweather has been craving the opportunity to fight Oscar De La Hoya since 1999. And I'll touch more on Floyd Mayweather in part 3, but that is Oscar De La Hoya's mindset. His mindset is to come back, win a title in a division that can see him have an advantage over getting a guy like Floyd Mayweather to come up in weight. And he looks at everybody in that list at the junior middleweight division, and he could have fought anybody else. He could have fought, a Corey Spinks, but he chooses Ricardo Mayorga. He chooses Ricardo Mayorga for a couple of different reasons. Number one, Ricardo Mayorga, as much of a resume that he's built in terms of wins and losses, there's one thing that Ricardo Mayorga has that a lot of fighters don't have. And that is, he has the ability to absolutely be unpredictable in the fight. So it makes for a good friendly fight. But also, Ricardo Mayorga has had wins over Vernon Forrest, who was somebody who had absolutely dominated Shane Mosley when he was undefeated. So Ricardo Mayorga has had wins over a really good fighter in Vernon Forrest. He's lost fights against Corey Spinks for an undisputed welterweight championship. And Mayorga has not only moved up in weight, but he's also been able to become a world champion in the process again. So, and Mayorga has also fought Felix Trinidad at middleweight. So Mayorga has had a healthy resume of guys who have something in common with Oscar De La Hoya, and he's the perfect guy on the surface for a 35-year-old Oscar De La Hoya to come back into the sport and to fight. And for Oscar De La Hoya, he absolutely goes into the Mayorga fight with a huge chip on his shoulder. Mayorga's talking shit. He's talking shit about him. He's talking shit about his family. He's talking shit about his wife. He's talking shit about everybody because that is who Mayorga is. And for Oscar De La Hoya, this is the type of fight that garners people's attention, that brings them to watching pay-per-view. Not only is it a comeback for Oscar De La Hoya, but it is the right type of comeback. And Oscar De La Hoya, after the first 3 rounds of Oscar De La Hoya just having to deal with this wild maniac in the ring, he absolutely starts to tag Ricardo Mayorga with left hooks. And eventually he puts Mayorga down with a left hook to the body. And then he also begins to absolutely destroy Mayorga while he's on the ropes, leading to a 6th round stoppage, I believe. Now you have an opportunity for Oscar De La Hoya, who can now set himself up to really launch and propel Golden Boy up into a fight, which will be essentially the richest fight in the sport. And that's what Oscar De La Hoya is planning to do. And for him to do it, he needs Floyd Mayweather. And that is where we are going to leave off part 2. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will put part 1 into the description of this video. So if you want to go back and if you want to look at, what happened with part 1. But with part 2, we see the separation between Golden Boy and Top Rank. Oscar De La Hoya's retirement from the sport, which allows him to focus more on his company. He brings in Richard Schaefer. He's able to get four really good names in the sport, including himself, between Bernard Hopkins, Shane Mosley, and Marco Antonio Barrera. So he starts to slowly build his roster, and he starts to allow Richard Schaefer to negotiate these deals between him and the fighters between, the different promoters that they'll be doing fights with. And it ultimately leads to De La Hoya's revival back into the sport, becoming yet another champion in the junior middleweight division, which is a 154-pound limit, and ultimately setting up his company to take part in the richest fight in boxing. At that time, I should say.